What is going on, y'all? KMBest here. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. And interestingly, I think it's most important that we start with 34 Card Monte, not necessarily as the best deck in Marvel Snap, but as the one that defines what allows other decks to be good. 34 Card Monte is a deck that is built on and predicated on the idea of doing something that is just a little bit more unfair than any mid-range deck is reasonably capable of matching. That is generally why this deck exists. It's trying to go over the top of mid-range decks, it's trying to have dangerous snaps, but it also has relative weaknesses. The reason this deck was able to see so much success in Golden Gauntlet 2 and is still continuing to see that success is because that mid-range decks in this metagame have not reached their final form. People are still messing around in what I like to call the Midrange Primordial Soup. They're all playing a bunch of different builds. There are 4 different Annihilus decks people can be playing. There are 3 different Thanos decks people can be playing. There are a bunch of different Galacta Gwenpool piles. And until those are refined and we're very clear on what the best versions of them are, it is advantageous to play a deck that we know the best version of. Nobody has any quibbles with card slots in 34 Card Monte, largely because they matter a lot less, but also because it's really only the 5-drop slot that you're arguing about. Are you playing Infinity Ultron? Okay, cool. You could also be playing Kang. It wouldn't meaningfully change how the deck works. I've seen people do that. And I think that this is the kind of deck that thrives in unrefined metagames where people aren't sure what the best point package is, or when there is genuine ambiguity as to what the best point package is. It makes sense that a deck like this is succeeding when we've seen an incredible point package nerfed in the form of Thanos. Sam Wilson was a part of many incredible point packages, also nerfed. This makes sense. What I'm not seeing is a coherent reason to believe that this deck will be the best deck in the game at any point in the foreseeable future. If I were you, I'd be looking much harder at refining those mid-range decks, because once one of them really starts to understand, here is my consistent point output, this deck ends up not being able to keep up with that level of power. So for me, this is sort of my preferred version of the mid-range point output deck. Obviously, a relatively favorable matchup into 34 Card Monte on the basis of all of our stats. Because this is a deck that is cutting out the more interactive Gladiator Fenris Wolf package in service of a much higher ceiling Werewolf by Night thing, it is more easily able to demand answers from a 34 Card Monte deck, which puts it in an advantageous position. The way you want to approach fighting that 34 Card Monte deck is to make them answer you, rather than put you in the position to be answering them. Answering them's not bad, but you want to be able to have a baseline of power that forces them to answer whatever it is you're doing. So with that in mind, the Werewolf is doing a lot of work here, getting up to double digits and threatening a lane on its own. In addition, Loki can be a very valuable card against those 34 Card Monte decks because so many of the cards in that deck are obviously incredible, and presenting threats is the name of the game. This is a very powerful and self-contained shell that has answers to almost everything the metagame will throw at you. I consider it a very high-end deck in this context. Afflict has always been a little bit of a pet deck for me. I love decks that play Anti-Venom. It's one of my favorite cards in the entire game. And so typically I end up a little bit high on this deck relative to where everyone else ends up on it, but I do think I'm right about this one. This is a metagame that Afflict is sort of built for. When we talk about how a bunch of this metagame is mid-range decks refining themselves, we're just trying to find the best Cannonball Mercury deck, the best Annihilus Merlin deck. All of that stuff is so cool, but you can just get outstatted by a deck that is a little bit beefier than you. There is a story that gets told, or like a teaching analogy that gets told in Magic the Gathering about the guy with a deck full of 2/2s versus the guy with a deck full of 3/3s. And what always happens is, the 2/2s guy has an advantage until the 3/3 guy stabilizes the board. And that's sort of the lesson that this deck is teaching you relative to other mid-range decks, which is you don't have a lot of the early game curve out stuff that other mid-range decks do right now. You don't have a Merlin, you don't have all the cool stuff that deck can do. What you do have are a bunch of incredibly beefy lane-winning 4-drops that are just going to be big enough that they invalidate a lot of that early game stuff out of the other mid-range decks. There are other builds of Afflict right now that are doing interesting and weird things. There's the Splat build with Domino and Quicksilver and no Wiccan that is playing like Sarah and stuff to just, again, double down on being a mid-range beater. There is, of course, the Wiccan build of this, which is doing a much similar thing to that, but it ends up running like just too many 4s. Not that I think it's a bad necessarily choice for this, but it is something that you have to start considering. If you really hate 34 Card Monte, I already think this deck has a favorable matchup into most RSM decks. It's going to get a lot more favorable if you put a Cassandra Nova in here. That's obviously a pretty ridiculous thing to rip off of a Malekith against the 34 Card Monte gamer. Just some really cool stuff that this deck gets to pull off that puts it in the position of being the bigger mid-range deck against the mid-range decks, and then just having a lot of power into the 34 Card Monte decks. Downside, absolutely zero possibility for interaction against combo decks. You will get run over by discard. You will get run over by Mr. Negative. You will get run over by move bounce. That is really kind of the downside of a deck like this. It's sort of hyper specialized at being a mid-range beater, and so it does not really have anything beyond a Red Guardian for the decks that are not trying to interact with you in a fair way. Side note, Cougar has been tinkering around with the explosive Ajax shell, including Merlin and Werewolf, which still allows you to keep the miles in here. I think this could be a genuinely interesting direction for this deck to take, and I wanted to just highlight it as an alternate build on the previous. I have typically enjoyed playing these because I like playing curve out mid-range, but right now I do think it's probably a little more advantageous to just play the Zabu Surge style, invalidate the other mid-range decks, and then hopefully just go to town in that way. This is a very interesting alt build or splinter build. There are so many Annihilus decks in the current metagame, and it's impossible to talk about all of them, so we're going to do a pretty quick run through of the major varieties of Annihilus decks. First, we're going to start with the baseline 12-card Annihilus deck. This is the one that is the lower to the ground version of the deck. You're using Merlin, you're using all of these cards in order to alleviate the downside of the Sentry and turn it into an upside. So Merlin's Polymorph will do that, but you also have Annihilus to make it an upside in a different way. The interplay between Annihilus and Polymorph is actually very interesting, and I think that is a fun little dynamic to exploit if your opponents are preparing to get the Void sent over by an Annihilus, and then suddenly they fill that lane up, and it's actually just turning into a 5-drop. That's definitely the kind of thing that can be exploited. This is a deck that is predicated on Merlin, and frankly, the archetype itself is predicated on Merlin. People are doing this stuff because turning Sentry into a 4-9 with massive upside is a really powerful thing to do. One of the things these decks tend to lack, not always, but tend to, is meaningful interaction for combo decks. These are also decks that, much like the Afflict deck, are positioned to try to be anti-mid-range decks. When both people are playing fair, you have access to these massive point swings and the clogging of your opponent's boards and things of that nature. Here we see the introduction of Annihilus and the removal of any legitimate, tech interaction, right? These decks do run the gamut. We've seen one with a Shang-Chi in it. We're going to see one with a Shang and Enchantress in it. And here we see one with neither. Again, doubling down on, I'm going to be a little bit bigger than you. I'm going to be the mid-range deck that goes over the top of you. I will say this. There are so many Annihilus decks. It was very difficult for me to figure out which one I preferred, which one I thought was the best one, which one I was able to meaningfully have the most success with. I could tell the difference in texture. This is a slightly less controlled, slightly more high-rolly, slightly bigger ceiling version. That's what the inclusion of Agamotto does here. It gives you another thing in order to alleviate the downside of that void, and of course the hood. So you have now, in addition to Merlin's spells and of course Annihilus, you have images of Icon, which will be able to alleviate that downside just as well. And of course you have access to Agamotto, his own spells. The Bolts of Balthak is incredibly powerful. This is a higher ceiling, lower floor version because your bad draws are notably worse. This is the fully teched out Lambie series version of this, where the previous builds were from Honifer and Get Wrecked. This is Lambie's sort of, all right, I have to run these cards. I'm playing Shang, I'm playing Ench. Where does that leave me in terms of how this deck looks? And it looks much, much heavier. This is a deck that has some legitimately poor draws in it when you're just sitting there holding Tech and an Annihilus at the beginning of the game and you're doing nothing. There are a lot of situations with most of these decks where I find myself really missing a good 2-3 curve. When you draw Merlin on 2 in any of these, it's such an advantage because it's just so much better than all the other 2s that you have access to, barring maybe a Surge, but even then, like, just giving you more things to do, more possibilities, is just a really powerful effect, and you really notice it when you have, like, one of your 2s that adds cards to hand, Merlin and Kate Bishop, as opposed to the other ones, especially when you're chilling on these very heavy hands in a deck like this. Last of the Annihilus decks is the Supergiant Ronan Annihilus deck. I think this is a very interesting attempt at fusing 2 very odd and powerful and unique sort of forms of point allocation together. Being able to put an Annihilus face down on turn 5 leaves you open to like final turn sentries that then send over a void on the final turn of the game. There's a lot of power in this, and having multiple game-changing 5s is really, really interesting and difficult to play around. But ultimately, I think this deck gets a lot out of being difficult to play around, and it has a tendency to get outpowered. Like, if you are difficult to play around, that's awesome, but if someone is just doing something that has more numbers than you, that's hard for you to overcome. You need to be the smart one basically all the time. This deck is asking a lot from you, and on successive turns, you'll have like very game-defining decisions on 4, 5, and 6. It's a tough spot to be in. I actually really enjoy the Rabbit Sweet version of Ronan Supergiant, which is the version of Supergiant that I'll be highlighting here as the like Supergiant deck du jour, and I'll tell you why. I just talked about how like a Supergiant deck typically has this thing where it's got a bunch of power in it, but ultimately it runs into situations where there are some decks that are just going to be able to cheat hard enough that it doesn't matter how much power it actually has. This is a Supergiant deck that can cheat a bit, right? We have our Wiccan going on here. We get to be a Wiccan deck in worlds where Supergiant is not going to be meaningfully effective, in worlds where we don't necessarily have the priority setups we want. We get to be a Wiccan deck, go for extra energy, go for extra power, just play a bunch of big guys and go to town. Wiccan is a generally excellent card right now, and I think Ronan deserves special mention here because so many decks, as we've discussed, are playing not just Merlin, but also Kate Bishop, cards that just naturally fill up your hand. Ronan is naturally larger in the context of this metagame than he has been in previous ones. Thanos Skaar is my preferred version of the deck right now, in large part because of all of these mid-rangey decks. One of the things that really helps this deck is that it gets to just sort of naturally be bigger than a lot of them. We've talked about how important that can be against 34 Card Monte. I consider one of 34 Card Monte's worst matchups that isn't just like a deck playing a Cassandra Nova, something like this deck, right? Where you just play Surtur, you play 4 10s, you play a Scar on the final turn of the game for either 3 or 1. And it's just like, oh, right, I need answers to that and I don't have any. And so that means that the 34 card deck has to go vertical, and it's not always very good at going vertical. It's good at being tricky, but not necessarily at going tall. And I think that that is the pressure a deck like this puts on the metagame. This is, in my opinion, one of the better decks in the game. And I would like to take a moment to say rest in peace to Skada727, who was a diehard Surtur main, a Scar main, who was playing a lot of a deck very similar to this. I actually talked to him about this list before he passed. And so just take a moment to say thank you to for the contributions that he made to this community. A weird thing happened this week. I didn't play any Cannonball Mercury. And the reason I didn't play any Cannonball Mercury was because I wanted to play all the other decks. I was like, oh, okay, I need to figure out what else is good. And I realized, like, while I was making this video, that I probably was giving up equity doing that, and I probably should have been playing more Cannonball Mercury. I think almost everyone in High Infinite had the same idea, where it was like, okay, we know what's good, let's go find the things that are new and unique and unrefined. Let's go play a bunch of Annihilus decks, let's go play a bunch of Supergiant decks, let's go refine that, right? And that's what it felt like recently playing in High Infinite. We should probably be playing this. Like, this is still a really strong deck that does really strong things, that is just naturally going to have some massively powerful draws and do a bunch of massively powerful stuff. Again, I'm not positive that there isn't a better version of Cannonball Mercury out there, but a lot of the stuff I've seen is getting really cute, and I don't necessarily want to get really cute. I personally think that you don't need to tech for 34 card Monte with this list, but you absolutely have the latitude to put of course, Cassandra Nova in here if you want to. Now, the thing about this deck that I don't like is the Gladiator. Like, I don't like him. I don't like playing Gladiator. He makes me very sad right now. There's a lot of big guys running around. He will sell the game multiple times. Is this statement influenced by the fact that I played Gladiator into 2 separate 34-card Monte decks and pulled 2 randomly generated deaths to lose me 4 cubes each time? Maybe. It might be influenced by that. But still, my overall point remains, I really don't like playing the guy. I wish I had a better option, but he's too synergistic with the package for me to cut. On to the combo decks. Let's talk Mr. Negative. Now, Mr. Negative has typically been in a pretty specific role. The highest ceiling combo deck with the most potential to trip and fall on its own face. And I think that remains roughly true. It is still that, and it still does that. That said, there is a little more willingness to play Mobius, from me at least. I very much dislike losing to this deck. It makes me very sad, so I get Mobius into my decks when I can. If you are not playing Mobius, you are effectively raw-dogging the metagame and asking to lose to this. I really don't have a better way of describing it. Like, you are almost certainly going to lose to a good Mr. Negative draw. You are almost certainly going to get bullied out of the game. They are going to play Ravonna Renslayer. They are going to snap you. They are going to be correct. You are going to lose 2 cubes, right? That is ultimately what this deck is looking to leverage. My best piece of advice for you is, if that happens to you, don't cope stay. Don't reward them for this. You need to be smart with your cubes when you run into this stuff. Don't stay for 4 against a Mr. Negative. You're probably not going to actually pull it off. I think I'm going to pull it off so many times. The amount of times I've actually pulled it off, it's probably like maybe 30% of the time. Don't risk it. The natural cycle of Marvel Snap metagames is that when one deck gets a little bit too dominant, or when one archetype of deck gets a little bit too dominant, other archetypes rise up to crush that deck. Right now, we're dealing with a lot of mid-range and a lot of sort of non-interactive 34-card Monte. One of the best ways to beat a metagame like that is to be a combo deck, and here we're defining combo deck as just a deck that gets to levels of points that a normal mid-range deck really can't compete with, and simultaneously is not really able to be interacted with in a meaningful way. There are 2 decks right now that, in my opinion, fit this description. Discard is the first of them, Move Bounce is the second. I think you could argue Hela might also fit this description, but right now I prefer the first 2. The reason for this is that these are decks that have the ability and the consistency to perform against a wide variety of what the metagame has to offer. As much as I describe this metagame as Midrange Primordial Soup, it's still doing very powerful stuff. But what isn't really incredibly present in the metagame is just a deck with all the tech cards in it. The closest we have is that Spawn of Yakub deck that I showed way back at the beginning, which, if I'm being honest, is much more a thing that I am positive is strong than a thing that I think the metagame is positive is strong. I've seen Shamo playing a very similar type of like all-tech Gwenpool Galacta deck, except he was using a Mr. Sinister. So like, it's definitely something that like high elo players are sort of on, in the sense of like, oh, we need the new tech Thanos. Like, what's our new tech Thanos? What are we going to do that, right? That is sort of where my head is at for this, where it's like, I think this is probably the stuff. that is going to beat basically everything other than the deck playing all the tech cards. And I think that's a really powerful spot to be in, personally. These are very powerful decks. Discard is a very powerful deck. Your snaps are very hard to deal with, your point allocation is obtuse, your plays are complex, and you have massive ability to generate points on the final turn of the game, or earlier, depending on when you want to set yourself up to win. It's a very powerful deck that hits very high levels of points, that is very difficult to interact with in a one-size-fits-all way, the way Mobius crushes Mr. Negative. Move Bounce is very similar to Discard in my mind. I think this deck is benefiting a decent amount from the relative lack of Cannonball Mercury in this metagame, and I'm not saying there's not a lot of Cannonball Mercury in this metagame. I'm saying there's a lot less than when I hit rank 1 with Cannonball Mercury and literally half of Infinite was playing that deck. When I did this video last week, literally half of the games in top 10% Infinite were that exact deck. That is not true anymore, thank God. And so that means that there is able to be more diversity in your combo decks. I think last week I would have said it's got to be Discard if you're trying to go over the top of this. This week, I think both Discard and Move Bounce, as relatively non-interactive, high levels of points decks, are proper applications of this principle to this metagame. I strongly believe Cerebro's just underrated. Like, I get that it feels bad to play sometimes, but I genuinely think C2 is just a good deck. The biggest downside it has in high-level play is that it's a very predictable deck. Like, I'm a pretty good player, and I'll still catch myself just like shortcutting and being like, well, I know this is my best play, but I haven't done the math to make sure it actually wins. Cerebro basically does the math for your opponent. It's almost impossible for them to not know whether or not they're going to win here. Like, it's a very predictable deck with very predictable point output, but that very predictable point output is very, 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 very high. And I think that that is notable. But like when you look at a deck like Discard, right? They don't know, if you're playing against Discard, your opponent doesn't know whether you're going to be like Blade Modok, hit a swarm, and then start bullseyeing a bunch of swarms, or just you didn't draw a swarm and you have to sit there and like copy, blow up a Scorn a bunch of times. There's a big delta in outcomes, right? And so when you're making a play to stay in a game, a lot of the time what you're doing is trying to figure out the range and figure out what percentage of the range you beat. Cerebro makes that incredibly easy. You just know. You know how many points they're going to have. It's incredibly easy to tell. You can count, and then you add 3, and then you add 6 to each one of them. We did it. You know the range. And so when the range is that easy to understand, knowing whether you're going to win or lose is often a very, very easy thing to do as well. Against almost every other combo deck, there's a lot more ambiguity about placement and things like that. With this deck, there just isn't. Finally, a couple of honorable mentions here. This is, I believe, the Derek build of the Ancient One. I've actually particularly enjoyed this. I also played the Husky Puppies build of the Ancient One, and I felt like I was missing a lot of the big top-end cool stuff, by which I mean Infinity Ultron. I gotta tell you, like, when you're playing without Infinity Ultron, it does sometimes feel like you're just capped on numbers in a really unfortunate way, even though I will say, I did play the Husky Puppies build. I went like 5-7, but I gained 11 cubes going 5-7, so people were not prepared for it, I can tell you that much. I think this is a deck I like. I would hesitate to say that it's like my favorite version of this, because I think we all know my favorite version of this is the one running the Anti-Venom, because I love playing Anti-Venom, even if I don't strictly think that it's the most correct thing to do. I strongly believe that there is something in the Victoria hand space that has left itself relatively undefined. And I think the real question for these Victoria hand decks is, what is the end game going to be? You could see us going for a positive end game here. But with so many decks going so tall, I almost wonder if it might not be better for us to go for a negative end game. A sort of tech shell for the Victoria hand stuff might be the way the future of this deck ends up looking. Now, I'm not overly convinced that this is necessarily always a metagame player, but to my mind, Victoria Hand is a competent mid-range shell, and I think that's really what I'm trying to get across here. The details, I think, are going to matter a lot here, but the baseline thing I want to get across is people look at mid-range shells and they're like, oh, okay, we got Galactic Gwenpool, we got Annihilus Merlin. Victoria hand is one of those. It's like a little bit worse maybe, but V-hand stuff is on that level. I'm going to keep banging this drum. Thanos Skaar is just a pretty good thing to be doing right now. If you are below the rank of Infinite at this point, I think it's a very solid option if you happen to have these cards to just play this deck. It is simple. It leaves so much of your brain open to think about the implications of what your opponent is doing. Your plans should not take a lot of effort. They just are what they are, and that is a powerful thing. If you're trying to get better at Marvel Snap, I think this is a great deck to play. If you're someone who wants to hit Infinite for the first time in Marvel Snap, I think this is a great deck to play. I'm taking my cue here from Second Dinner. They keep nerfing this deck, and there is not, I think, a lot of justification to do that based on super high level play, which means it's related to the sample size that they use for their stats, which is, as I understand it, the top 50% of ladder. Not Infinite, ladder. Meaning, in the sample size they use, there is clearly a portion of the ladder for which this is an outsized performer. My theory, that portion of the ladder is basically 70 to 99, which is exactly the place that the people watching this video are trying to get out of. If you really hate 34 Card Monte, you can try the Dark Razor build of Silver Surfer. This is something that Razor used to hit rank 1, and it is I'm really a little bit kind of iffy on it if we're going to be completely honest. I think it's very good into a world of 34 Card Monte, and if you're going to do a 24-hour stream playing against a bunch of 34 Card Monte, which is what happened, this is a very good and reasonable attempt at just being like, I'm not afraid of you, I'm going to beat the crap out of you. I do like the other thing it's doing, though, and I think this is important, because we've talked about how Surfer as a points package isn't necessarily able to keep up with all the stuff that's happening right now. Adding some RNG and high rolls into that with Gambit and Moon Knight and Fenris, it ain't bad. Like, it's really not bad. Like, it's another sort of directionally correct thing that I kind of like about what's going on here, where it's like, okay, so Surfer doesn't necessarily keep up on its own. Let's supplement it with some big boy high rolls. We've got our Gambit Proxima. We've got a Fenris Wolf bringing back something big. We're going to strip the resources out of their hand, and then suddenly we are competing on the same axis, and I'm going to be better at competing on that axis than they are. I do think it's like very good deck building for what it's worth. I'm just not necessarily convinced that other people playing it will see the same level of success. Another wonderful one trick, of course, this is Jet's build of Phoenix Force, and it is basically for if you hate 34 Card Monte so much that you are willing to sacrifice everything else for it. One thing I find very funny, though, is that this deck is actually performing very well on Untapped recently. I think that's just awesome. I don't, again, particularly buy it. Like, part of the reason I think people come to me instead of to a stats website is so that I can provide context of this nature. First of all, I think a lot of those games are probably from the Phoenix Force guy, and they'll be a little bit worse once it gets into general population. But second, I think this is just a very difficult deck to play. There are a lot of awkward things that are hard to think about. It stretches muscles that you aren't used to using in Marvel Snap. This is sort of the reverse of the Skaar conversation that we had earlier, which is, I think that deck is a deck that is very easy for anyone to pick up and play, whereas I think these last two decks are very hyper metagamed against specific things. Ooh, I'm going to have multiple Cassandra Nova procs against my 34 Card Monte deck. I'm going to play Cassandra Nova, I'm going to blow up Cassandra Nova, my Fire Hair is going to trigger, and then I'm going to Phoenix Force my Cassandra Nova. All that stuff, right? Like, that's super insane against 34 Card Monte. Against a normal deck, it's, like, pretty good. I don't want to give you the impression that this is, like, a purely only tech deck that has no plans otherwise. It's just that the plans are all weird and hard to figure out. But, like, you can do things like get a couple Hood triggers, get a couple Cast triggers, have a big Phoenix Force going around, you have your V-Hand and your Demons, and that's winnable. Like, you can win games like that. It's just a little bit harder than normal to get to that level of point output. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal. And I will see you in the next one. Remember to like and subscribe. If you enjoyed the video, leave a comment. I still read them. And thank you so much. I'll see you next time.